Good evening, everyone. It is once again Ted the Speed Learner, and I'm going to start tonight a brand new video series called Eusebius. Okay? And it's based on Eusebius' ecclesiastical history. Okay? Now, the idea and the premise behind this particular video series is that there's a lot of things in here that I know a lot of you can't read. Vocabulary, sentence structure they've got in here, so on and so forth. So I'm going to show you how to be able to read all this stuff. I'm going to try to give you an idea of what's actually in this book. It's not going to be perfect. I'm not a perfect person. But in the meantime, I wanted to let you know I'm running a live stream right now, so I'm going to be looking back and forth between my laptop and this, and my notes are on my laptop right now. So I'm going to go ahead and read you my notes on Eusebius' ecclesiastical history. I want you to take one more good look at this book. I'm going to bring it out just like this so you can see the whole thing. You can get this on Amazon. Okay, and if you can't find it, let me know and I'll show you how to get a hold of it. And I'm going to show you how to read this. Alright, here we go. Now, before I begin, I wanted to tell you, I sent this manuscript to James Patrick Holding, and he reviewed it, and he let me know everything was okay, so I'm going to go ahead and present all this material to you. Now, the earliest known manuscript of Eusebius that still exists today was created in 462 AD. This was 139 years after Eusebius created his text. Now, I want you to get this in your framework here. Most people back in those days lived about 40 years. Okay? They didn't quite make it to... Shoot, I'm 10 years older than a lot of people that were in that time. That should tell you something, okay? Not everybody, some people actually lived longer than that, but not a lot of people back at that time lived past their 40th birthday. So, the earliest known manuscript was written in the time of the grandchildren of the people that would have had this manuscript originally. The original Eusebius manuscript probably existed at the time that this copy was made. Now, could the copy have been corrupted? I would suppose a little bit, but you got to consider that the original manuscript probably still existed at that time. And they could have very easily have compared what the original manuscript said to what this said. And had there been any major errors, they would have said, oh no, you can't have this. So, this is a pretty accurate manuscript of Eusebius. Okay? Now, why is Eusebius important? I'll get to that in just a second. Alright? Now, if anybody finds a copy of this text that predates the RNL Codex Syriac A, okay, the RNL Codex Syriac A is the manuscript from 462 AD. If anybody ever finds something that predates that, then we can therefore compare that manuscript with the one known as the RNL Codex Syriac A. And we can see just how much corruption took place. Probably wasn't very much at all, if any. Okay? Alright, so until then, we have to pretty much assume that what we're reading in this Eusebius text is pretty much what they read when Eusebius pretty much published his work. Okay. Now, I'm presuming, based on what I've read so far, that Eusebius had the original manuscripts of the four Gospels. We're talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm pretty sure he read the original manuscripts. I have little doubt of that. Okay? It is entirely possible that he also read original copies of Paul's letters that were written by Paul himself, and if not written by Paul himself, it would be one of his scribes, okay? Because Paul may have had a scribe write those letters, not necessarily himself. Either way, it would have been the works of Paul, the original works of Paul. So I have little to no doubt that he had original manuscripts of this stuff. We don't have those manuscripts today, but I'm sure he did. Okay? Perhaps he read manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel that were actually written by either Matthew or Matthew's scribe. Remember, Matthew wrote his Gospel less than 75 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. So Matthew's original manuscript at that time was less than 300 years old. Okay? So you got to keep in mind, we actually have the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution that were written about 250 years ago. I'm sure that when Eusebius was alive, he had the manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and all the letters of Paul. I'm just almost positive he had the originals. And he probably read them. Okay? Alrighty. Eusebius starts by stating the purpose of his work. But to read it, you have to have a vocabulary lesson. And this is where reading his stuff becomes difficult. Okay, so we're going to go through some vocabulary, and hopefully you'll learn a few things. Now, what is the word successions? What is the etymology of the word successions? The word actually comes from the Latin prefix sub, which means either under or after, okay? And the word also comes from the Latin verb sedere, which means to move. In a literal sense, this word means to move something to another destination. Now, it would be kind of like in shipping. Okay, you're going to move something from one destination to the other. In this case, we're going to refer to a last will and testament. Okay? Now, I know that's kind of a stretch, but there you go. Alrighty. Now, what about transactions? The etymology of this word comes from the Latin prefix trans, which means through. That's why they have the transcontinental railroad. Okay? And the Latin verb agere, which means to move forward. Okay? So, now the process of buying something from a store can be called a transaction. Okay, so you're moving things from the storekeeper to the customer. That's how that works. Alright? Eusebius stated that he would tell everyone who presided over the newly established Christian community during the time between the original apostles and the times of Eusebius. Now, what he is talking about is all the events that happened from the time of Jesus' crucifixion all the way to his own lifetime. Okay? He also intends to give a chronological history of every person who publicly proclaimed the gospel. Some of these people had scribes record the words that they were speaking. Others didn't. There are many reasons for this. If you want to know those reasons, you can ask me at a later time. Okay? Between the time of the apostles and Eusebius, there were people who were proclaiming a false doctrine that appeared to be Christian. Eusebius was planning to not only document all the people who were proclaiming the right gospel, but also people that were proclaiming the incorrect, were proclaiming false gospels. And he wanted to document it. Eusebius wanted to document that. Okay? All right. Now, some of these people preaching a false doctrine actually persecuted people preaching the real gospel. And in some very nasty ways, too, I have to say. Alright? Now, Eusebius also planned to document the disasters that befell the Jewish community during the period between the crucifixion of Jesus and his own lifetime. It's unfortunate that he did not distinguish between the leaders of the temple and the common everyday Jewish citizens, because they've made a lot of misinterpretations. Some people have read this manuscript and incorrectly assumed that all Jewish people despised Jesus, and that wasn't true at all. This has led to a series of atrocities that have occurred since the manuscript was written, and that's sad. Okay? Eusebius also planned to document the number of times and the means which nations tried to suppress the new Christian community. Eusebius also planned to document the martyrdom of Christians. He wanted everyone to know when they were martyred and how they were martyred. Okay? Even though Eusebius even though Eusebius had a lot of documents that he could access, he himself admitted that he couldn't present an exact history of the early Christian church because not everything was documented. Some documents were destroyed by the Roman Empire. Remember, the Roman Empire invaded Jerusalem. So they destroyed a lot of stuff, including valuable documents. And some other documents just simply weren't written at all. That's because many Christians at that time were martyred before they could compose any manuscripts. Sad, but true. Eusebius constantly prayed to God for guidance in creating this extensive manuscript. Now, we have to define more vocabulary words. You're like, oh my, we're going to get a vocabulary lesson like you wouldn't believe tonight. Alright. The word vestige, its etymology is derived from the Latin noun vestigum, which means a tiny piece of evidence. This is where you get the word investigate. Okay? The next word is intimation. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Intimation. The word is derived from the Latin word intimare, which means to announce something or to proclaim something. Alright, remember, some documents at that time were written by genuine Christian authors. Others, however, were written by false teachers. Eusebius had to distinguish between authentic documents and false teachings. That was not always so easy. Okay? Alright, and now another word. The word is epitome. It comes from the Greek noun epitome, which means a summary. Okay? Now that we know the material Eusebius decided to present, we have to discuss the first piece of information that Eusebius decides to present. He started his treatise with the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. And if you want to know what the meaning of treatise is, it's like a collection of works that he has. It'd be like having several volumes, like an encyclopedia, that kind of thing. Alright. Alright. Now, the title Jesus of Nazareth had a special meaning. Remember, Jesus came from Nazareth. Alright? And that little town, and that was, to a lot of people, that was a hick town. Really was. So you can about imagine how many problems Jesus had right off the bat. Many people at that time didn't consider residents of Nazareth of having much knowledge or wisdom. As far as many people were concerned, the residents of Nazareth were basically the common people. They were just common trash. Some people saw them as dirty people. Need I say more? Eusebius recognized the divinity of Jesus, yet he also recognized that Jesus became, as Paul says in Hebrews 2:7, that would be Hebrews chapter 2, verse 7, a little lower than the angels. This way, Jesus could experience our infirmities and teach us how to overcome them. Eusebius wanted to establish that Christianity wasn't an invention of his generation. It all started with the birth of Jesus. Okay? Now, Eusebius declares in chapter 2 of his works, this work, okay, that Jesus is the only Son of God. He also declares that Jesus existed before creation existed. He uses a lot of scriptures to do this. Now, we have another word, another vocabulary word. Abstruse. And I believe that's how it's pronounced. If I'm wrong, you can go ahead and correct me. The word abstruse comes from the Latin prefix ab, which means something that is away from something else, and the word trudere, which means to push. So you're pushing something away. Okay? So in this case, you're not just pushing it away, you're trying to hide something. So, using it in chapter 2, he was saying that the knowledge that he's now presenting was pushed away from the lay people. Okay? Eusebius also refers to Jacob and says that Jacob saw God's... okay. Well, I skipped something here. Hold on. Eusebius makes a reference to Moses to declare that Jesus is God and the Son of God. Then Eusebius refers to Psalms 33:9 to support his argument. So, where is this town called Mamre? Many scholars believe that Mamre is located about a mile away from the city of Hebron. Hebron is south of the city of Jerusalem. Eusebius points out that Abraham worshipped the man that appeared to him there. Eusebius presumes that the man that appeared to Abraham was none other than Jesus. After all, had Abraham worshipped someone other than Jesus, God would have condemned Abraham at that very moment. Okay? Alright. Eusebius also refers to Jacob and says that Jacob saw God face to face and lived. Now, as you know, when we had God and Moses at the burning bush, God said, don't look upon me, because you look upon my face, that's it, you're toast. Okay? So, for Jacob to look God face to face and live, then that would have to be Jesus according to Eusebius. Okay? Alright. So, if Jacob was looking at God and living, then most likely he was looking at Jesus instead of God. Okay? And in this case, he has a pretty good logic on that. Really. Alright? Eusebius also makes a reference to Joshua. Joshua saw Jesus because Joshua didn't fall on the ground and was immediately buried. That didn't happen. So, and we know that Jesus is God because he says the same thing that God told Moses in the burning bush. He told Joshua to remove his shoes. Okay? So, what is the meaning of the word antemundane? Well, let's look at the etymology. The Latin prefix ante means before, and the Latin word mundus means down to earth or universe. So the word actually refers to something that existed before the universe existed. Okay? Eusebius declares that in the Old Testament that mankind wasn't ready to receive the gospel of Jesus. That's because certain things didn't exist at the time. In the Old Testament times, Jerusalem looked more like a village than a modern city. Their understanding of science wasn't the same as ours. Let's face it, people back then didn't understand psychology or a lot of other things like we do today. As a matter of fact, people were basically lawless until God himself appeared on the top of Mount Sinai. They didn't really have big laws. Not like we know them today. Okay, and now we got to go through another vocabulary lesson. Yeah, there's a lot of vocabulary in this book. The word conflagration comes from the Latin prefix con, which means together, and the Latin verb flagere, which means to burn up. So the word actually means inferno. The word obdurate comes from the Latin prefix ob, which means against, and the Latin word derare, which means the process of making something harder. So the word means a person who is stubborn or has a hardening of his heart. After God gave the law of Moses, the Israelites shared the law with those who had traded. The Israelites shared this law with those who they traded with and those they communicated with. Remember, the Israelites were captured by the Babylonians. They obviously shared their knowledge of God's laws with their captors. Of course, they did that in Egypt too, and they did it in all other places. Okay? Even Daniel saw both God and Jesus in a vision according to chapter 7 of his book. Eusebius refers to this when he discusses why the gospel wasn't presented to the people of the Old Testament. Eusebius states that the Old Testament prophets praised the name of Jesus even though they were never formally presented with the gospel of Jesus. He starts his discussion by citing Exodus chapter 25 verse 40 and Hebrews chapter 8 verse 4. Then Eusebius says that Moses was the first person to use the name Messiah. He never directly says when Moses uses the name Messiah for the first time, but he does say that Joshua was originally named Oshea according to Numbers chapter 13 verse 16. And in some Bible translations it states that Moses changed Oshea's name to Joshua, okay, which is a kind of a form of the name Jesus. Eusebius also mentions that Moses gave the name of Jesus to a high priest. but Eusebius doesn't give a direct reference to the event. Eusebius states that Jeremiah makes a reference to Jesus in Lamentations 4, chapter 4, verse 20. He also states that David references Jesus in Psalms chapter 2. And that's all I've got for you tonight. So that's a lot of stuff. You need to go back and forth through this video and learn all this stuff, because I'm going to cover a lot more before this is all said and done. Okay, so you've learned quite a bit in one session. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope to see you soon, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.